to our talk with Carl Jacoby and Chip Williams, or Robert Williams is his formal name. I welcome you very much to listen to this talk. I'm Marcia Weisiger in the Department of History, and our class in U.S. historiography for the graduate students, we have just finished reading Carl's wonderful book, The Strange Career of William Ellis, and I think you'll find the story that he has to tell fascinating. Carl Jacoby received his PhD in American history in 1997 from Yale University. He then went on to teach for a time at Brown University, moved to Columbia a few years ago, where he currently serves as professor in the Department of History and in the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race. He is the author of 3 books. The first was called Crimes Against Nature, Squatters, Poachers, Thieves, and the Hidden History of American Conservation. And that is also a wonderful book that explains how hunting regulations transformed subsistence hunters and fishermen into poachers, redefined foraging as trespassing, the setting of fires in forests as arson, and the cutting of trees as timber theft, while benefiting elite sports hunters, all in the name of conservation. And then his second book was called Shadows at Dawn, A Borderlands Massacre and the Violence of History, although it was then subsequently re-subtitled as An Apache Massacre and the Violence of History. And that book looks at a massacre of Apaches in the 1870s at the Camp Grant massacre, and it looks at it from the point of view of 4 different ethnic groups, the O'odham, Mexicans, Anglo-Americans, and the Apaches themselves, and it's really a tour de force of narrative storytelling. I've been using this book, and George Sheridan has been using this book for a number of years in teaching students how to think about narrative when we write history and to write good storytelling. It's a fabulous book. I highly recommend. And then his talk today draws on his latest book, The Strange Career of William Ellis, the Texas slave who became a Mexican millionaire, which tells the little-known history of a somewhat obscure man who was born into slavery in East Texas. And the book explains how William Ellis, and he'll explain all of this, reinvented himself again and again in the process of reinventing himself or telling the story of reinvention. Carl shows how socially constructed racial categories really are. And the other speaker that we have today joining Carl is Robert Williams, who will, after Carl is going to give a talk, then Chip and Carl and I will sit over at the table to have a conversation. Chip is the great-great-nephew of William Ellis. And through various means that I'm sure Carl will communicate, he discovered Chip and his family, and they have collaborated on this book. And I think it's a model of sensitive scholarship. It's just incredible what he undertook. Now, I have a relationship to this project too, so I thought I would mention that as to why I'm going to be also sitting on this table, at this table. I've known Carl for a long time. He's best friends with someone who's a friend of mine, and so I knew him through this. And we've had, I don't know, lunch together at conferences and things like that. And one day, it was shortly after I had joined Facebook, because my sister and a cousin had put up a bunch of family photos, and they insisted that I join Facebook, and I wasn't particularly interested, but I signed up. And then I got an email one day from Carl asking if I was related to the Weisigers who had come to Texas by way of Virginia and Kentucky. And I wrote back, I think, and said, well, yeah, I might be, because I understand we're all the Weisigers in the United States are related, and I know my forebears came from Virginia and lived in Kentucky. I know nothing about Texas. And then a few days later, I got a message through Facebook from someone who wrote, are you from the Weisigers who came from Virginia via Kentucky to Texas? And I was like, this is weird that 2 messages like this. And I wrote back and I said, yes, probably. And this person wrote back to me and said, well, my family may have had a business relationship with him. So I thought, well, that's interesting. So I friended him so that I could find out who this person was. And the minute I saw that it was an African-American man, I thought, oh, the business he's talking about is slavery, because I knew that my family in Kentucky had been slave owners. And so then I will say I was on sabbatical that year in Pasadena working at the Huntington, and I discovered from looking at the Facebook site that this guy, Chip Williams, was living in South Pasadena. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Maybe I should meet with him. And I know I emailed my husband or talked to him on the phone, and I said, what do you think? Should I meet with this person? And he was like, oh, I don't know. It's kind of weird that he happens to be in Pasadena and emails you. Maybe it's a stalker. And and I was like, well, I don't know. His website, he looks like a nice guy, you know. He's a great photographer, and he's traveled all over the world. He seems really interesting. And then I contacted my sister, and I said, what do you think? And she said, oh, of course you've got to contact him. You know, you can't not do that. So I did, and we set up a meeting at Pete's Coffee Shop in Pasadena, and he brought along his mother and his aunt. And at any rate, we'll tell you more about how that story unfolds, but it tells you what a small world it can be, that I already knew Carl, and he'll explain how he figured that out, I suppose. So at any rate, this is a very personal story to me. I kind of feel like Chip is part of my family in an interesting way, and maybe in a literal way, as it turns out. So at any rate, I welcome Carl Jacoby, and we'll uncover the mystery of William Ellis. Thanks.
So I wanted to thank Marcia for that very generous and unique introduction, and I also wanted to thank Chip for making the trek all the way up here from Los Angeles. And my talk today is going to be a little bit different than the normal history lecture, which is to say, normally with a history lecture, we talk about our findings, what we found, and what that means. And I do want to do that, but before I get to that, I want to talk a little bit about methodology. I want to talk about how I found what I found. And the reason I want to do this is, on the face of it, that may seem like one of the more boring things that we do as historians, methodology. But I actually think it connects us to some very vital questions at the heart of the historical enterprise. It touches on important issues about the ethics of doing history. It even touches on important issues about the philosophy of history. When we're talking about history, what exactly does it mean to do history? My story starts, however, like most history stories, in the archives. Way back when I was in graduate school, one of my graduate advisors, who knew I was interested in northern Mexico and the borderlands, suggested that I look at some US consul reports from northern Mexico and write a short research paper out of that. And in an odd way, this whole book and this whole project is an outcome of this very short, what was supposed to be a very short research paper, but grew and grew and grew into something quite different. So I went into this with no particular document or anything that I was looking at. I was just doing what you often do in the archive, which is to leaf through documents, hoping that you're going to find something interesting. And initially, I was quite frustrated because most of the consul reports were quite boring. They had to do with business relations or very quotidian issues about staffing and everything else. And I had no idea how I was ever going to write a paper about any of this. And then all of a sudden, and this is one of the first episodes of several moments of serendipity in this project, I turn the page and I out-tumble all of these fascinating documents about an episode in 1895 when hundreds of African-American sharecroppers from Alabama and Georgia relocated to a hacienda in northern Mexico in a place called Tlahualilo, which is right on the Coahuila-Durango border. And the documents made clear that this event had triggered an enormous diplomatic crisis between the US and Mexico, and it actually triggered very significant debates on both sides of the border about what this migration meant and whether it foretold a really radical reorganization of race and labor on both sides of the border. And just to give you a few images here, the first of these here, this is a shot of some of the colonists from a US government report. You'll note that they're described as refugees down there, and not as immigrants or anything else. The second shot actually is from the area around Tlahualilo. This is, oh, can people not hear me? Can people hear me better now? All right. This is the area around Tlahualilo, Mexico. It's actually one of the most arid regions of Mexico. It had been the heart of the Comanche Empire, and so very recently acquired by Mexican and foreign landowners. And as you see there, what they're doing is they're digging an irrigation canal. The only way really, it's incredibly fertile land, but the only way to make it work was by bringing in labor. And there was very little labor there because the Comanche had basically depopulated this area. And this was one of the reasons why people there were willing to experiment with bringing in African Americans from the US South. They were planning to grow cotton, and they figured, well, what better labor force to bring in than the labor force that has grown most of the cotton in the world, which were African Americans. And this shot here is a shot of the borderlands from the time period. And I like this one. It's just a little bit disorienting, I think, really because the border is, it's in there, but it's rather hard to see. It's a rather faint line which traces the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo there in Texas. And what really stands out about that image for me is the railroad going north-south and linking Mexico and the US together much more than they ever had before. And this is what it made it possible both to imagine exporting cotton from Tlahualilo to industrial centers, both in Mexico and in the United States, and also the possibility of importing labor from the American South. That all of a sudden Mexico and the United States are in much closer contact with one another than ever before because of the railroad. So like I said, this episode had triggered remarkable debates within both Mexico and the United States. For the United States, it was something of an unwelcome wake-up call to realize that even though most white Americans thought about Mexico as a primitive, backward nation, to imagine that actually hundreds of African Americans would find it a potential place of refuge, a place to escape from Jim Crow and segregation. This is happening in 1895, so 1 year before Plessy versus Ferguson, was unnerving to Americans who all of a sudden were nervous that this labor force might end up leaving the American South and heading in to Mexico. For its part, Mexico was having a debate about really the desirability of having not only Americans as immigrants, but also African Americans. Mexico did desire immigrants during this time period. The basic rhetoric of the era was that Mexico had all these rich natural resources, but it needed labor to unlock it, and so wanted to attract labor, had been unable to compete with the United States in attracting immigrants from Europe. This was the ideal form of immigration to Mexico, were so-called Latins, which would be Catholic, white Europeans, French, Italian, Spanish. But in the absence of being able to attract a lot of those immigrants, then they begin to experiment with possible other forms of immigration, Chinese, and also, as in this case, African Americans. However, as you can see, this is really running against the whole desire at the time to whiten Mexico by bringing in European immigrants if you're bringing in African American immigrants. And so there was a tremendous debate in Mexico at the time about how assimilable were African Americans into Mexico. As one Mexico City newspaper, El Tiempo, observed, modern states, and modern was very much a status that Mexico aspired to during this time period, modern states worked to acquire unity, and it was seen that bringing in African Americans would only add to Mexico's racial diversity and potentially add to its perceived racial problems, rather than allowing the nation to acquire the unity that it so badly desired. So this brought up all sorts of questions for me. There's obviously the fact that Mexico is actually, in this national period, has more or less erased the presence of Afro-Mexicanos, that there's actually a significant number of peoples of African descent in Mexico, but they are, after the colonial period, they're sort of imagined out of what the Mexican nation is. There's a mixing here of streams of colonialist discourse about colonization. So there's a stream of colonization discourse in the United States that generally has centered about African Americans leaving the United States, usually for Africa, Bishop Henry Turner being the preeminent person with this, where at the same time Mexico is thinking about the desire for colonization, which they see as bringing in immigrants to their nation. And this is one of the few times when those two discourses are actually matching up, and you can see somehow someone, and we'll get to that, someone is thinking, well, if African Americans are going to leave the United States, why don't they go to Mexico, which is actually looking quite actively for skilled immigrants? And really the question above all that stuck out for me was who was behind this movement? Who had seen that with the expanded transcontinental railroad system that it was possible to bring African Americans to Mexico much more easily than ever would have been the case before? There were scattered references in the archives to someone known variously as William Ellis, Guillermo Ellis, or Guillermo Eliseo, who was, depending on who you believed, according to these documents, either a Mexican, a Cuban, or, quote, an intelligent-looking mulatto. And initially I was unable to resolve this mystery and figure out who this uncommon border crosser was. And I ended up instead just writing out what I did know into a very short little article that I published and sort of setting it aside and working on some of the other projects that Marcia mentioned in her introduction. At the same time, in the back of my head, I knew that I was onto something important, that I had come of age during the so-called New Western history, which had really been thinking about what are new paradigms that we can use for getting away from the so-called F word, the frontier. And so I at least had been one of those people who had been very attracted to and seduced by the idea of the borderlands, the idea of trying to look at, which I saw at root as trying to look at things from multiple perspectives and trying to use multiple archives, often in multiple languages, rather than the frontier, which usually tended to focus on simply a question of US expansion with very little consideration of what was happening on the other side of that expansive wave. And in this new context of the borderlands, this means that the border crosser, the person who's moving back and forth across these borders, is not the odd marginal figure, which they would be in older paradigms, but they really were instead the illustrative figure of their era. They're the person who really allow you to understand how the borders are constructed in the first place. The challenge was that by crossing borders, that made them very elusive and difficult for a historian to research, because not only is their documentary record scattered across various national archives, the border crosser, because they're often working at cross purposes with national projects, they often are trying to hide or obscure a lot of what they're doing, and therefore very little of what they do can manifest itself in the documentary record. And certainly that was my experience, that there was this interesting person, there's a number of tantalizing clues, but very little opportunity to really get my hands around him and understand who exactly he was and where he had come from. And then a few years later, I too, like Marcia, had a fellowship at the Huntington Library, and at that moment, several people had contacted me about possibly taking the short essay I had written about the migration to Tlahualilo in the 1895 and turning it into a longer piece for a new anthology about new approaches to borderlands history. And so as I was there, I made some efforts trying to expand this into an essay. And it was this moment there was a sort of second episode of serendipity in the project. It was fortuitous that I was at the Huntington, which had a very complete run of newspapers and city directories from New York City, actually. And thanks to working through all of those, I was able to see that there actually was someone named William Ellis or Guillermo Eliseo who had been on Wall Street in the late 1890s and early 1900s. And it seemed there were suggestions that this William Ellis or Guillermo Eliseo was the same one who had been behind the 1895 effort to settle African Americans in Tlahualilo. So I felt I'd made good progress on this project, and I was feeling kind of pleased with myself. And so I wrote up this piece of the project, and it came out in 2004 in the anthology called Continental Crossroads from Duke University Press, which was edited by my good friends Sam Truitt and Elliot Young. what I didn't realize at the time, ironically, is that I was actually much, much closer to solving the mystery altogether, and that the key to this mystery of whoever this man was not actually to be found in Mexico City or in New York City, the two great North American metropolises where he spent most of his time, but actually, as Marcia also discovered, much closer to the Huntington, where I was at that particular moment, in the Los Angeles area. But not knowing any of that, I basically, and not knowing what else to do about the project, I then ended up turning to a completely different project altogether, Shadows at Dawn, A Borderlands Massacre and the Violence of History, which came out in 2008. And it wasn't till after this book was out that I then returned to the question of this particular project and who was behind the migration in 1895. And in the meantime, and here's another stroke of serendipity, a digital revolution had swept the archives, which really made the process of doing research about such an elusive character much easier than it ever would have been before. Before, when I was trying to find, say, newspaper articles about this episode, I just basically had to scroll through reels and reels of microfilm, and my eyes would glaze over, and I'd hope that I didn't space out and miss some article. But it's just basically, it's mind-numbing to just kind of do that. But now there are these massive databases which bring together dozens and dozens of newspapers, and I could just plug in William Ellis and all the variations on his name, and all of a sudden all sorts of articles about him are popping up in all sorts of places that I never would have thought to look, like Denver. There was a lot of very interesting newspaper articles about him there, and I never could have done this if I'd had to physically scroll through years and years of microfilm. As well, census data had been digitized, and this made the whole process of trying to track him in the census much easier than it had ever been before. One of the most significant features of the census, of course, is that it not only does it track just sort of names and ages, but it also tracks race. It's really one of the central mechanisms through which race is created and then reinscribed in US life. The Census Bureau instructed its enumerators as they went door to door to assign everyone a racial category. So in the 1910 census, for example, enumerators are given the following options: W for white, B for black, MU for mulatto, CH for Chinese, JP for Japanese, IN for American Indian, OT for other. And this is how the figure known as William Ellis or Guillermo Eliseo appears in that 1910 census. So this is just to give you a sense of the thing as a whole. This is what the census page looks like. It's from Mount Vernon, New York, which is, at the time, was a quite sort of tony, all-white suburb, one of the first suburbs in Westchester County, just outside of New York City. And then this is the portion where William Ellis or Guillermo Eliseo appears in the 1910 census. And if you read across, you can see that he's married, he's white, he's married, he's been married for a number of years. He has a number of small children, that he emigrated in 1869, and that he speaks English. Then, once I had this information from the census, I was able to locate documents such as the birth certificate for his firstborn son, who was born in New York City in 1904 when his parents were living at 300 Central Park West, in a building which was named then and is still named today El Dorado. And this would seem to be the appropriate name of a building for a rich, figure from Mexico, as Guillermo Eliseo seemed to be. And you can see there, he shows up, he's listed on the birth certificate as a banker and a broker. And it also, the birth certificate seemed to me at least to perhaps offer some suggestion about how to understand the name, that probably his original name was Guillermo Enrique Eliseo, and that William Henry Ellis was just a way of translating his name into English for the ease of non-Spanish speakers. And birth certificates like the census are also one of those points at which race is really created in American life. And here, what's significant about this birth certificate for his firstborn son is that the race for his son is indicated as white it says Mother English, Father Mexican. So far so good, but the accessibility of the census data also opened up a riddle for me. If I followed the paper trail backwards from Mount Vernon, and then from New York City, I didn't end up in Mexico, as you might think, but I ended up across the border in Texas. And the Guillermo Eliseo, or William Ellis, that I was finding in Texas did not appear to be Mexican at all. Instead, he shows up in the 1880 census as living in Victoria, a small town in southern Texas. And so here is the census sheet for the whole from Victoria, and then here is, if you read across, I think he's listed as Willie. I can't see, this is where I'm located here, but I guess he's listed as William. It's the previous one he's listed at 1870, he's listed as Willie. But here, of course, what's one of the things that leaps out right away is that when you read across, the space for race does not have the W for white that we saw earlier, but here instead you see the MU, which is for mulatto, and that's the same for the rest of the family. And so if the Guillermo Eliseo that we encounter in several decades later in New York City, he's dwelling in a fancy residence on Central Park West, and then in suburban Westchester County, he's a banker and a broker. The young William Ellis is living in considerably more prosaic circumstances. His father is a warehouse man, and his grandmother, who lives with the family, is listed as a washerwoman cleaning other people's dirty laundry. And then if you go back even farther, it becomes even more modest. In the 1870 census, where he does appear as Willie, his father is a shoemaker. And then in the 1860 census, the Ellis family does not appear at all because they're in the slave census. And in the slave census, it doesn't list names. It only lists tallies of basically a property of white property owners. So clearly something odd was afoot. I had an intuition that what I was seeing was something like a real-life Great Gatsby, which is to say a young man from a poor rural background who changes his name and moves to New York City and finds great wealth. But I realized that the only way I was going to be able to justify my hypothesis or prove my hypothesis would be able to track down some of William Ellis's living relatives in the hope that they might know some of the family history and explain to me how it was that a former enslaved African American from Victoria, Texas, named William Ellis, was able to persuade so many people that he actually was a wealthy Mexican named Guillermo Eliseo. Now, the trouble originally was that Ellis's widow and children disappear from all of the US records after 1925, and I couldn't locate them. Until finally, in a sort of other stroke of serendipity, I decided that what I would do would be research the lines of his siblings. So rather than trying to track his immediate line, as you see there in the census, he has several siblings. Fanny, Hezekiah, they're written quite oddly in the census here, Hezekiah, Avalonia, and Isabella. And so this trail led me first to San Antonio, where several members of the family relocated in the 1880s. It then took an unexpected turn west. Most of the family relocated during the Great Migration to the Los Angeles area, originally settling along Central Ave, but then resettling afterwards. I was stunned to discover to Pasadena and Altadena, which is to say the area where I had been living when I had been doing some of the research on this project at the Huntington Library. And in fact, one of the members of the family, Susie Williams, who is Chip Williams' aunt, lived just a couple blocks from friends of ours in Altadena, who I'd repeatedly driven by her house when I was going to visit our friends, not knowing that what I should do would be stop and knock on her door and ask her questions about William Ellis, and all of these questions that I had would have been resolved years and years earlier. So for me, this close call stands as an eerie reminder of all of the potential misconnections in any historical enterprise. And it also reminds me how embedded we are in history, even though we often are unaware of it. That is, James Baldwin once put it, history is literally present in all that we do. Once I established contact with the families, we had a flurry of revelations. I tried to show them all the documents that I'd found about William Ellis, and they in turn shared with me several family photos and letters that they had, which offered a much more personal view of him than I'd been able to locate before. And I just wanted to share three of my favorites with you. So this is a shot of William Ellis, and his sitting in the chair is his father. And then in the sort of exquisite, I don't know what I call those Little Lord Fauntleroy kind of sailor suit things, are his two eldest sons. And this photo, as you can see from the caption or whatever, the tagline down at the bottom, was taken in Mexico City. And one of the things that it demonstrates is William Ellis was staying in contact with his family, but given the challenges of what he was doing, which was, you know, crossing the race line from black to Mexican, it was very important for him to control how he contacted the family so that people wouldn't discover his secret, right? And so that Mexico became a place where he could connect with his family outside of the gaze of sort of a suspicious white world. The next image here, this is William Ellis's office on Wall Street. And you can see that listed Mexican and Cuban, you know, stocks and bonds there on the window. This shot always gives me a little bit of angst as a historian because I just see all those papers piled up everywhere. And I just the sense of if someone had kept those, how much easier that would have made this entire project. But virtually, as best I can determine, virtually none of those papers remain anymore. Some of the few papers that we do have are the stock certificates. He had a variety of investment companies that he managed, and they tended to have this very sort of elaborate, beautiful stock certificate like the one that you see here. So eventually I decided I probably have enough material actually to write a book about William Ellis, much to my surprise. But I decided before I did that I really felt that it was only proper that I get the family's permission for doing so. Now, this was in no way I would say an absolute requirement by the historical profession, which is to say that as historians, we enjoy academic freedom to write about most anything we want. And I'm an ardent supporter of this, this allows historians it prevents people from squelching historical research into topics that might be inconvenient or embarrassing. And so historical transparency in this context isn't just an academic luxury, but it's a fundamental part of a democratic society because it allows us to see how the decisions that affect us get made. But all that being said, I also felt that the ethical compass took on a slightly different dimension when the object of one's study was not a powerful politician or a powerful business person, but rather an obscure former slave who was engaged in a virtuoso act of reinvention in the face of a society that would otherwise deny him his full humanity. But since I'd be exposing long-buried family secrets, I wanted to make sure that the family was supportive. So after a number of emails and phone consults, I ended up flying out to Pasadena several years ago to meet with them in person. And I did this with a little bit of anxiety, knowing that if they were opposed to my doing this research, and I thought it would be quite reasonable, frankly, that they might be opposed to it, that I would have to set aside all the research that I had done. But I would rather do that, I thought, than be involved in a very tense battle with the family over who had the right to tell his story. And also, I think it frankly would have been a much worse book because without some of the images and letters that the family had, and without being able to do interviews with the family and hearing family stories that they had about William Ellis, it would be a much impoverished project as well. So fortunately, and this is the greatest stroke, I think, of serendipity in the whole project, they were very supportive about me doing the project, and they said, we'd love for you to have something that condensed a lot of the family history. But the one concern is that since the sort of three sisters who are the matriarchs of the family and really the guiding spirits of the family, when I was speaking with them, they're saying, well, we're getting up there, and so could you write this book quickly so that we can see it? And, you know, which I was, of course, willing to try to do, but of course, at the same time, I'm thinking in the back of my head that academic scholarship tends to go slowly, right? That it's much, it's a certainly years and years sort of project. And probably I worked on this project all told about a decade when you add it all up. But I'm pleased to report that the book was published just this summer, that all three of the sisters, Fanny, Susie, and Joan, are alive and well. And they've been able to join me at several of the presentations that I've made out in the California area. So this is us when we're speaking at UCLA. And this also has members of the Mexican family as well who are involved. Now, when I met with the family in Pasadena, one of the first questions I asked them was the name of the family who had held their ancestors as slaves when they lived in Victoria. And they offered the name Whizziger. And when I asked them how they spelled it, they said, well, we're not quite sure, but we think it would be spelled Whizzaker. And so I start looking through the records, and there is no family with that name, but I did notice a family in Victoria that otherwise matched the historical details, that had been slave owners, that they'd owned a plantation in Victoria. They were recent arrivals from Kentucky and had previously been in Virginia. And if I should have pointed it out, but if you remember one of those earlier census datas, you can see that when it listed William Ellis's father, it said that he was from Kentucky and that his parents were from Virginia, right? So you can sort of see the trajectory of the spread of slavery in that one family history. And the name of this family was Whizziger. And this was, of course, a name I'd heard before because I'd known Marcia for several years. So I sent her, in retrospect, what was probably a kind of impertinent email saying, would you have any connection to this Whizziger family in Texas? And I just checked our records. I did this in 2009 is when I emailed you. And Marcia responded with a very gracious note telling me that that might be true. And so as we dug into the details, it turned out that actually that was the case. It also turned out that in South Texas, Whizziger is pronounced Whizziger, so that the family had the name right, the pronunciation right, they just didn't know how to spell it. Joseph Whizziger, the patriarch who moves his family from Kentucky to Victoria, Texas, had been married 3 times. He outlives 2 of his wives, and then he moves with his 3rd and final wife to Victoria. When he moves with his final wife, he leaves behind some of his younger some of his older children in Kentucky, and that's the branch of the family that is Marcia's family. Joseph Whizziger, I think we have this right, is Marcia's great-great-great-grandfather. And this was another stroke of serendipity in the project. Not only did I know Marcia and have tremendous respect and affection for her, but she didn't pull a Ben Affleck and try to deny that there was any sort of what her family history was. And in fact, she helped me to explore this past. So a few years ago, we arranged a trip together to Victoria to see if we could find the plantation where William Ellis was born. And it was helpful to have a Marcia Whizziger there who was able to help open doors with family members in a way that I don't think a Carl Jacoby from New York could have done. So here we are on the former plantation. This is a former sharecropper shack on what would have been the Whizziger plantation in Victoria. And this is, there's Marcia. That's on her right is Corky Goodman, who would be the owner of the plantation. And on the left is Craig Whizziger, who's a distant relative who was kind enough to take the day and show us around Victoria. Yeah, that tree was there. And so that tree is also amazing. That tree is, they told us, because Texas A&M did a study, is over 300 years old. It's one of these great live oaks that they have in South Texas. And so even though the original building isn't there, you can imagine that that tree would have been quite substantial even in the 1850s and 1860s when William Ellis was growing up on the plantation. And this is the moment where I think we can begin to ponder some of the questions put forward by philosophers of history, and this is why I think methods actually can open up some very important questions for us. that one of the most basic points that philosophers of history have raised has to do with how we think about time and how we divide time up into units of analysis. That time is this continuous stream, but the ways we often break it up into segments, the most fundamental being into past and present, has its risk that it can always risk distancing us from whatever we deem to be the past, that is inherently distancing to certain events. And often we divide the past up into segments like the antebellum period or the Reconstruction, which again sort of suggests discrete units, which are again very sort of distant from the present that we occupy today. Yet in this project, I've been continually stunned by how past and present have blurred together. On the personal level, it has to do with finding out that William Ellis's relatives were neighbors of friends of mine, or that a colleague that I'd known for years was also intimately connected to the history I was researching. On a more professional level, it might be the realization that as much as we might often like to locate something like slavery or Jim Crow in the distant past, that it really does bleed into the present as well. And I think the tree here is a nice symbol of that this is a form of continuity that has seen the present, but it has also seen Reconstruction, it has seen the rise of segregation, it has seen slavery as well. I don't really have time to talk about all the insights about William Ellis's life that I'd like to, although the one thing I do want to point to is that for me, as a historian, what I find most fascinating to think about his life is the way that it shows that these two phenomena of the 19th century, two defining phenomena of the 19th century, the color line and the border line, really are mutually created during this time period. And so Ellis is both moving across the borderline, but he's also moving across the color line. I'm often asked what Ellis looked like, and there's really no easy answer to this question. I think it underscores for me how much perception is subjective, even though he lived in the era of photography, which is often seen as this objective way of recording the truth. And so what I've arranged for you here is a gallery of images which can allow you to see some of the variations in how he's perceived. One of the things that really leaps out for me about this is how he's perceived in keeping with certain tropes about what an elite Mexican is trying to look like. So he's also crossing a class line. He's not trying to say, I am a Mexican campesino. He's trying to say that I'm an elite Mexican from Mexico City, someone who's connected to the Porfirian elite of this particular time period. So here's one shot of him from the New York World in the early 1900s. And here he looks, I always say he looks like the Monopoly man from the game. And that's not, I mean, it's funny, but it's true. I mean, the Monopoly man is the caricature of a capitalist, and he also here is a caricature of a capitalist, down to even his sort of stout build, which is suggestive of someone at the time in the Gilded Age who was enjoying the best of food and wine and life would have been, there's a politics of the body, right? And so that he would have been, that would have been sort of seen as something like what a wealthy person is supposed to look at, to look stout like that. Here's another image of him from much the same time period, a little less stout looking, but very much similar tropes. Here's a shot of him, an etching, which always oddly looks to me like sort of Teddy Roosevelt a little bit. Here's another one where he looks quite suave and debonair. Here's one of, it's just one of my favorite photos, and there were a couple, when the book came out, a couple newspapers ran reviews and they all wanted to use this photo, I think just because it's such a great photo, and it suggests that his act of ethnic reinvention isn't simply a question of phenotype, of skin color or everything else, but it has a lot to do with dress and bearing and everything else, right? It's a performance that involves a lot of things beyond simply purely your body. Here's another shot. Here's a shot. This one I kind of find interesting simply because of the chair as a sort of, again, a piece of stagecraft. And here's a sort of more candid shot from not long before he died. And it's very difficult, I think, first knowing his history, and secondly being, I think, trained by American culture to try to see people in racial categories, to look at William Ellis with a completely open mind and because I look at this image and I tend to see a black man when I see that image. And it's very striking to me that someone who could, in certain circumstances, if the camera is recording in this way, could look like this, could actually be perceived like this by a number of people at the time. And one reason I think that so many people were willing to believe that William Ellis, the ex-slave, was actually Guillermo Eliseo, the wealthy Mexican banker's broker, is that he knew how to play to his audience's deepest desires, that much of the Gilded Age's booming industrial economy depended on raw resources from Mexico, and so William Ellis was the person who could facilitate American investment in Mexico. And under these circumstances, Americans did not have too much of a reason to want to dig behind his mask to try to tear down the facade, because they wanted to believe that this was a person who could actually facilitate the wealth that they were so anxiously seeking. So he's sort of playing on the greed of his audience, in other words. I'm trying to move a little bit quickly here so we can have some time for discussion. What's interesting about William Ellis is that he never pretends to be Mexican in Mexico, because it's not particularly useful to be, say you're Mexican in Mexico, right? There's a lot of other Mexicans there. When he's in Mexico, he always says that he's American, so that he's always playing the other side of the border. He's realized that one way to get outside of racial categorization in both nations is to claim this elite foreign status, and to be an American in Mexico at a time when many Mexicans want American investment, at least in the Porfirian government, and then to be a Mexican in the United States at the time when many Americans want to invest in Mexico. So it's, in one level, a very lonely move, a very clever move. On the other hand, it must have been a very lonely move, because it meant that he was always a perpetual outsider in whatever nation he tended to inhabit. So there is some larger academic points that I want to make about how race was conceptualized differently in Mexico and the United States. That during this time, Mexico is moving towards an idea of mestizaje, of racial mixing, at the very same time that the United States is moving towards a one-drop rule and notions of racial purity. And one thing I want to suggest, using the story of William Ellis, is that this is not just coincidental and accidental, that actually Mexico and the United States, their racial systems are growing apart during this time period, and that's actually a result of the economic integration that they're enduring. So that, ironically, as the two nations begin to interact more with one another on an economic level, the railroad brings them into closer contact, they begin to think about how do we separate each other out sort of culturally, and one of the race becomes a very important way of doing this. So this means that when William Ellis is crossing the border, he's also moving from one racial regime to another. And this allows us to see that although the borderline may be geographically peripheral to both the United States and Mexico, it's actually quite functionally, culturally central to each nation and to each nation's ideas of race. And this project has also underscored for me the peculiar alchemy of the historical process. Through an odd chain of serendipity that I could have never imagined when I began my research, William Ellis has been given a rebirth of sorts, one that calls into question the tidy separation that we often impose between past and present. And today, for example, he's managed to call together a descendant of slaves and a descendant of slave owners, and he allows us the opportunity to think together in specific and concrete ways about the great, often unacknowledged burdens that American history imposes on all of us. So thank you very much.
Okay, now Chip and I and Carl are going to move over to the table and take questions, but also talk amongst ourselves, I guess. We haven't really scripted this part, but
No.
But before we do that, I failed to acknowledge the many people who helped to support this with their funding. So I want to do that real quickly and thank Kodak, which is the Center on Diversity and Community, the Honors College, University Housing, the Global Scholars Hall, the Department of History, Ethnic Studies, and Julie and Rocky Dixon have all been helpful in supporting this event. So at any rate, we'll move over to the next table. What? Oh, yes. Yeah. Where are we sitting?
Chip is going to sit in the middle.
Okay, good.
So the purpose of this format in many ways is to suggest, it's to decenter a little bit the professional historian as a sole interpreter of the past. In this case, there's an interesting blend because Marcia is both a family member of, and sort of who is someone who reckons with this history as a sort of genealogical project, but also a professional historian, so she straddles that divide. But Chip is obviously someone who's coming at it from a sort of family history perspective, and then I'm coming at it from an academic history perspective. But my feeling is that we're all historians. We all have to grapple with the past, and we thought it would be much more illuminating to try and put all of these together rather than just have me singly answer questions. So I guess what we need, unless anyone has a comment, is to get a brave Stoll who wanted to start the conversation off by asking a question.
Jack.
Yeah, one detail, I don't remember if you've given us the year of Ellis's birth.
It's 1863 or 1864. So he's born at the very tail end of slavery, but the end of slavery comes.
He wouldn't be a kid in the slave census.
No, he wouldn't be a kid in the slave census.
But he is in the 1870 census.
He is in the 1870 census.
Okay, the thing that interests me, we have the 1870 and 1880 censuses. And by that time, 1880, he's still a teenager. In the mid-90s, he's in Mexico as a Yankee business promoter.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm being reminded of Mark Twain's and Charles Dudley Warner's character, Colonel Sellers.
Mm-hmm.
Now, since he's on the Mexican side of the border, he would have to appear as an American business promoter, and maybe their stereotype of that wasn't what Americans would have. But I'm interested in, I'm thinking Victoria is way over in East Texas. He's on this crucial railroad route in the Rio Grande when he's in the 1890s. Has he been somewhere more cosmopolitan or commercial in between where he's learned how to do the business promotion angle? Has he picked up the language, the character, the way these people act in the course of that?
Well, he moved from Victoria to San Antonio, where my great-grandfather, on the other side of my grandmother's father, so the other side of that family, was a school teacher. And he went to school there, which was very rare for African-American children at the time. And he got a little job in San Antonio working with an Irish immigrant. Victoria. Oh, was it in Victoria? Okay. He worked in Victoria with an Irish immigrant trader in hides and whatnot. And he worked with him sort of as an interpreter when he traded with Spanish-speaking people and whatnot, and learned business as his assistant, which eventually parlayed into business sense that he took into Mexico and was able to elevate himself that way.
The way I see it is that he had to almost ventriloquize this other person's business dealings, right?
Right.
And then at one point, eventually he realizes, if I'm doing all the negotiating,
why do I need this other person, right? And this is a moment when he relocates to San Antonio and takes on the new identity as basically doing the exact same thing that he was trained to do in Victoria, as an assistant in some person's shop. So he's flipping the switch because he was always supposed to be the assistant, the black assistant to the white store owner. But he's able to, by relocating, and this is key because you can't pass or reinvent yourself in your hometown. Everyone knows who you are, right? But the railroad opens up mobility, and so you can move to a new place, and then you can reinvent yourself in this new place.
Had he learned his Spanish in San Antonio and then returned to Victoria? Is that?
No, Victoria's it's a very interesting place. It's the one place in Texas, in most of Texas, in the antebellum period, where there's slavery, the local communities run out the Mexican population because they're worried that Mexicans are going to enslave slave revolts. And Victoria is almost the only community in Texas that doesn't do this. And that's because there were several prominent Mexican property owners, and so you can't really run out the property owning class. And so that meant that this was almost the only place in Mexico where blacks and whites and Mexicans grew up alongside one another. And so my closest guess is that often in Victoria during the cotton picking season, they would have slaves or then later African Americans picking cotton alongside Mexicans, and that through those sorts of interactions is how he learned his Spanish.
Okay, actually the presence of a planning and business elite there that would be bilingual might be some way to learn exactly how one would try to promote business across between those communities. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Other questions? Oops, gosh, that's loud. Other questions? Yeah.
I have one. Thank you both for coming to Eugene. I have a particular question for Chip. I'm just curious if your family talks about William Ellis. Maybe you guys are going to get to this, but growing up within your household, or maybe not at all?
Absolutely. He was a figure of great fascination for myself, my cousins, my sisters. In my home, there's a long corridor where we have basically like a museum of our family history. And for instance, the photograph of William Ellis with his two sons and his father, this man seated is my great-great-grandfather, I'm sorry. And I grew up with these photographs and with the stories. My mother and her sisters grew up with the stories about Uncle Willie, and they told us the stories as we poured through old family photographs like that. We had lots of questions. And we kind of confused a lot of his history because he passed as Mexican, he passed as Cuban, so we thought that he had property in Cuba as well as in Mexico and all these other things, and Carl kind of clarified those things for us as, you know, when he came into our lives. For instance, my Aunt Susie told us that she knew that our family had been on the Whizziger plantation. Whizziger wasn't a name that we were familiar with, but it sounded something like Whitaker. Is it a variation of Whitaker? So I played around with that in the internet age. I went on Google, couldn't find anything. And after we had met Carl, he clarified again that it was Weissiger. And I went straight to Facebook and said Whizziger, Victoria. And a lot of people came up, and I found Marcia also, and I just asked a lot of questions. So yes, he was a big part of our upbringing in terms of just learning about who we were. And a source of pride, a great source of pride, actually.
I'm curious how your family has responded to this history of William Ellis, because I mean, I have to say, when I got the draft of the book, I guess, before the book had come out, I went and looked up, like, okay, so what does it have to say about the Whizziger family? And one of the episodes that it tells, and this is after I've, like, gone and found this cousin who I didn't even know the existence of, the way us back up a little bit and say when we went to Victoria, Carl had said he'd really like to go to the plantation, and I don't know any relatives in Texas, so I went on the internet and through Switchboard went for who are the Weisigers or whatever. I knew that they were probably called Whizzigers. Everybody but my immediate family seems to call themselves Whizzer. Anyway, so I looked at these people and I found somebody whose age was roughly mine, so that I felt like maybe this person won't think this is a totally weird question out of the blue, and called him up and said, "Are you related to the Whizzigers of Victoria?" Because he lives in Houston now. And he was like, "Yes, and my grandfather was the local amateur historian of Victoria, and yes, I know where the plantation is, and I'll take you all out there." But I had never heard any of these stories of Texas at all. I knew that we were slave owners in Kentucky only. So it's interesting. So I'm just wondering, when I read the book, what I was going to say is that one of the episodes is that after emancipation, there is someone who, does he kill somebody? There's someone who kills somebody in the family, and so I might get this wrong.
One of Joseph Whiziger's sons, when he's coming back from his service in the Confederate Army, is shot through the mouth.
Okay.
And then he staggers home and he lingers for a day and he dies.
And he says an African American killed him.
Yeah.
And so then two of my family members, apparently, went and killed possibly some random African American person. And so that just felt like really, I thought, okay, we've just met Craig. I don't know him. I don't know how he's going to react to this. My family doesn't come off very well. I'm a historian, so I don't really care, actually. And I don't know these people, so I'm not invested in them in any way, shape, or form. But then, when I read the whole book, well, William Ellis is not the most savory character in the whole world either. So I was curious how... So I felt like, well, at least I'm just a sentence. My family is. You've got a whole book about someone who was, playing on people's ideas of things in order to accumulate wealth. So how have you and your family responded to this?
Well, with a bit of humor, because obviously a lot came to light about his business dealings and whatnot. There are two ways of looking at it. And on one level, when someone had an opportunity to pass during that time, it was a beneficial way of improving one's life. He never forgot his roots, he never forgot his family, he was not separating himself from his past as much as he was parlaying his phenotype and his ability to speak Spanish, his business sense, and others' ignorance about his background into an opportunity for himself. My family's take on that is that he did not what he recognized is that people didn't really know who he was or what he was, and he allowed them to think what they wanted to and went with that. Now, in terms of all of the business dealings and the running back and forth, when you read the book, you'll see that he, during the instability of the Mexican Revolution, he was going back and forth trying to get signatures to ingratiate himself to the different political figures of the time. As Carl has said, he was a capitalist. He's a banker, and that's the way that these people operated during that time. So, how do you put it? Neither more or less.
Yeah, there's a line that he's involved. I mean, it was interesting.
The FBI.
Yeah, it's interesting. One thing is that, in terms of speaking about serendipity, I was really so happy that Chip's family knew these stories about William Ellis, because frankly, if someone were interviewing me about my granduncle, I know very little about them, and I don't have photos. And granted, they're not doing all the exciting things that William Ellis was, but it would be a much shorter book. But there is an investigation. He's involved in a potential murder. So there were stories that the family knew very, very well, and there were stories
we didn't know that.
They didn't know. The story about the potential murder is one of the ones that they didn't know, because you can tell why selective memory. Why would one tell that story rather than other stories? And when that murder comes out, he's investigated by the State Department, and the State Department, the report says something very close to, he has the usual morals or lack thereof of someone on Wall Street. Which is to say that, you know, all of this sort of, he's creating, when you think these stock documents with all these sort of fanciful pictures of Mexico and his land of wealth, I mean, he's not doing anything particularly different than most people on Wall Street are doing in terms of, you know, creating fantasies of tremendous wealth, right? I mean, that's not something that he's uniquely doing at all. It's very much sort of the ethos of capitalism itself. One other point I was going to make. I can't remember it now. Oh, I'm sorry, I can't remember it. That's okay. Yeah,
that's okay.
But you know, when we did come across this information, when we were reading the draft, it was quite surprising. And we said, "Oh, wow, he's quite a character, isn't he?"
Yeah.
And so obviously everyone's got their shadow. He certainly had his
right.
as well.
But I mean, this is what I wanted to say. I remember now. One thing that, and this isn't really a critique of the book by the family, but it's more a critique of one of the reviews. One of the reviews called him a con man, which is never a word that I use in the book. And in fact, although he's creating these sort of fanciful images of Mexico, I'm not sure that he ever did anything, you know, outright illegal anyways. But the reason that both I and the family don't like the con man connotation is that it, you know, if passing is read as a con, if presenting yourself as Mexican when that's not your birth identity is a con and sort of, you know, is seen as illicit and bad, I think that really distorts the moral dimension of what's going on in the story, which is to say that really what's happening is the fact he has to do that is to get the most basic treatment as a human being to self-actualize during this time. And if there's any crime that's being committed during this time, of course, it's white supremacy and it's Jim Crow. It's not him throwing out potentially misleading clues about his identity. I mean, there's a great line from Langston Hughes, who went to Mexico a lot during this time period. He talks about how at one point he wants to ride the first-class train when he's in Texas. And so he puts this hair pomade in his hair. So he says he makes it look like Mexican hair. And he goes and he buys a ticket in Spanish. He just says, dame un boleto, wherever. And the ticket agent just gives him the ticket. So no, he never says, I am Mexican. He never makes that avowal. He just basically tries to present his, you know, his image and use language in a way so that someone can misinterpret who he is to his advantage.
George.
Just quickly looking at your book, it's a significantly sized book, and from the way you're talking about Ellis, you have a very, very rich human portrait. But the documentation that you showed us, to me, it puts together the pieces, but it's not terribly rich in the human detail. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what kinds of sources gave you that rich detail. I realize there's letters in the family, you know, there's some letters in the family, but I suspect, you know, this gives you some information. Did you do oral history? Is there a rich written documentation in newspapers and things like that? I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that kind of material.
Sure, surely. There's a lot, he's a sort of a character who pops up a lot in newspaper stories, and so that was one rich source, and that was only really possible because the newspapers had been digitized and I could find lots and lots of stories about him, because otherwise it was such a slow, painstaking process. Really, the best sources I thought in terms of giving a sense of his human dimensions were the letters to his sister, because I did have letters that he'd written to government officials and whatnot. He's a correspondent with Teddy Roosevelt and all these people. But those letters are very sort of, that's the mask, that's the official way that he's presenting himself to the world, right? And then to get the letters that he was writing home, where you can see him worried about family affairs and sort of complaining about what's happening in Mexico. Those were the ones that allowed me to see most of the sort of spark of his own personality. And then I did do interviews with Chip's mom and her two sisters, who had the best knowledge of the family stories about him and knew the most about the family history. But it was very much, you know, some projects, there's an archive on, you know, Thomas Jefferson. There's just a big row of things that are there, often already published and transcribed for you. But obviously a project like this, where someone is trying to pass, is a completely different kind of, you really have to assemble the archive from all these scattered fragments from all over the place. I think someone who would be the perfect passer, you could never write their history, because I think there would really be no archive to use. That in fact, because he stayed in touch with his family, which not all people who passed did, that some people would do the sort of cut themselves off from their family and just disappear, right? So that he kept in touch with his family, and also he's engaged in projects that are related to African American politics, so that actually after this whole thing happens in 1895 with the African American sharecroppers in Mexico, he gets outed, as it were, in San Antonio, that he actually is African American, because it has so many traces with African American immigrationist politics at the time period. And that's when he relocates to New York City, so that he can basically start all over, reinventing himself. And he learns to be a little safer or more careful in New York City. But he's always, even then, he's known. And what's really interesting is that not until after he dies do you see obituaries. So the New York Times is this sort of standard obituary of wealthy Mexican banker, blah, blah, blah. And then the African-American newspapers basically let go the secret after he's dead, and they out him, as it were, after he's dead. And so it's quite, and he's been in these African-American newspapers prior to his death. They never mentioned his race at that time, but clearly if you're reading between the lines, why is an article about, you know, William Ellis in you know,
Chicago Defender, or
yeah, or the
yeah.
Amsterdam News? Why is that in there? Well, it's clearly that people knew he was African. You know, the readers would know he was African American, and so there was all this knowledge in the African American community about him, but they kept the secret, as it were, until because they didn't want to hurt him.
Right.
Until
you respect the choice of the person who passes.
And then, but once he died, they wanted to claim, because this was someone who was tremendously wealthy and sort of well connected and powerful, and they wanted to use him as an example of saying, look, you know, there's this whole pernicious discourse of African American sort of inability to succeed in American life, but someone like William Ellis proves it's true. He's also proving that the real barrier is not having an African American background, it's the white prejudice that prevents the life opportunities of African Americans.
Carl, is it still true that you have no material that you've been able to trace from Ellis's New York family and descendants?
Oh,
or
do
have
you want to?
discovered some there?
Well, no, we have actually had a reunion, thanks to Carl's scholarship and research. You were able to meet Paula Olestia?
Yeah.
Okay. Carl made a contact in Mexico through the dance community, the art community. William Ellis's daughter became a dancer, a great dancer in Mexico. She but she was featured in many films in Mexico, and she studied, she taught dance, and a young woman named Paula Olestia, is that right, was one of her students. And somehow through Carl's research, and you should probably be telling the story, he was able to contact this woman who said that Victoria has nieces and a nephew who are still living in Mexico City and close to Mexico City, and an introduction was made. Since then, Peter, one of the sons, has come to Los Angeles 3 times, and we've had really sweet reunions with him, and then his sisters, who are also cousins, Letty and Andrea, also came for the UCLA and UC Santa Barbara events. So that history was traced as well, and we've had this wonderful reunion as well. We're hopefully going to a wedding in May in Mexico.
It's the afterword of the book is kind of this family reunion.
Yeah, he gave a workshop earlier before this talk in which he explained that he had set up a website with hopes that people would send information about William Ellis, and that is how you learned, right, that after 6 months of that website doing nothing, somebody wrote and said, oh, Victoria is somebody I studied with, and there's family. Yeah, so. Other questions? I thought I saw a hand over in that direction somewhere. No? Okay.
I'd like to just make a point. I wanted to mention this when you were talking about the past and present sort of merging in this research. You discovered that Marcia was part of this story and some other things, and I was just thinking, once you and I became friends on Facebook, I learned that Carl's wife and I have a number of friends in common. So there's this web of connection that we all have with each other. It's quite fascinating that William Ellis has made this happen, you know.
Well, and also I've been in contact with, because I got intrigued when I met them at Pete's Coffee and talked to his mother and his aunt, and I remember when we met, at the end of the conversation, I can't remember whether it was Joan or Susie said, I think it was Joan, said, well, now you can tell Carl Jacoby that you followed through and met with us, as though that was my only motivation. And I was like, I don't care about Carl. That is not why I'm here. I'm here because I'm a historian. I'm fascinated that this is part of my history that I never knew, that I knew. Long ago, I had been to Kentucky for a conference. And when I arrived home, like about 2 weeks later, my mother sent me a scrapbook that a family member had compiled. She had been a genealogist, such to the extent that she had bought her own Xerox machine in order to copy stuff. And she sent me this stuff, and so I'd seen that, oh, there's the plantation house in Kentucky, and I'd actually visited the business that had been owned by Joseph Wisiger as a doctor, and didn't know it while I'd been there in Kentucky. So, but I looked at that and I thought, well, okay, that's nice, and I put it away in a box and I never looked at it again until Chip contacted me, and I was like, oh, I've got this stuff and maybe there's something there. And then I discovered, I guess Carl told me that there was a woman in Kentucky who was who's a cousin, I guess, of mine, and I had never heard of her. And he asked if I would check her out and see if she had information. And she too is a genealogist and has compiled a lot of information in something that she calls the memory book, which she sent me last Christmas as a Christmas gift. And so it too has all this kind of history. So now, and when I met with them, I asked, what would you want to know? And they were very interested in the Ellis, where the Ellis name came from. Who is this Hezekiah Ellis? Mm-hmm. And what about Mary, and what's that relationship? And I don't know that I'm going to actually be able to find this because she was a slave. Mary was a slave, and so there's not a lot of information. But I am trying to pursue Hezekiah Ellis. And what I discovered, and this is again going on Ancestry.com, at the Family History Center in Salt Lake City. You can do it on your own, but they were kind of helpful in walking me through some stuff. And I saw that Hezekiah, when the family moves from Kentucky to Texas, Hezekiah does not follow them, because originally I thought he did, but he doesn't follow him. He moves to Missouri. And his family in Missouri, he marries a woman named Mary, and his kids have the same names as the kids that he must have fathered when he was in Kentucky. And so at any rate, I'm wanting to continue to pursue that, go and meet that cousin, the genealogist, and she's a Tea Party supporter. I mean, she's sort of like the opposite of me in so many ways that I've been sort of reluctant to contact her, but she seems very open to talking about history. She loves history. So I'm hoping to go meet her in the winter and see if we can unravel more of this, or put together, reconstruct more of the story of the early part of the Ellis family and their relationship to my family. And I'm trying to figure out what to do with that information. Right. But there's a story there to tell that I'm hoping to tell also.
Yeah, just to clarify, Hezekiah Ellis was a white man who was the overseer, basically, on the plantation in Kentucky. He seemingly is the father of, would be the grandfather, if I have that right, of William Ellis.
Right, he would be the grandfather.
One of the grandfathers of William Ellis. And that's where the Ellis name comes from, the overseer. And if you notice, when I put up the census, they name one of their kids. Not only did they take the Ellis surname, they name one of their kids Hezekiah as well. Although one can only imagine what a relationship between an overseer and a young black woman on a slave plantation would have been like. So there's obviously, I don't even know. So this is the great American topic, right?
Yeah.
But this is, so that's the Hezekiah Ellis that we're talking about.
Yeah, and Ellis shows up in the record. He's a tavern manager. I don't know what, she was the mother, I guess, of my great-great-great-grandfather. She owned a tavern in Frankfort, Kentucky, I think it is. And at any rate, he was the manager of that tavern. And so the overseer part, I think, is the family story. So I also am wondering if what my cousin Anne thinks, what she has heard through our family stories, if anything. Yeah.
The other thing I didn't think about until I was writing up this talk a couple days ago is that I did go and get Chip's family's permission to do this history. I never asked Marcia for her permission. At that point, I was pretty far into the project, but also, I guess my excuse was professional historians would never try to prevent another professional historian, but it did make me think the sense I have here of what the ethics of what I'm doing. It's interesting that I never thought to ask Marcia, so I apologize.
It's okay.
I apologize.
It's okay. I give you permission after the fact. But no, actually you shared with me much information early on, so if I'd had an objection, I would have said something, so I did not.
But I want Marcia to write.
I don't know what Anne, my cousin, or Craig, or anybody like that, except that Craig was willing to go along, and I explained to him, we're looking into them as slave owners. And the story, of course, that Craig has always heard is the common story of what benevolent slaveholders my family was. And I don't believe that is exactly how they come out in the book, because it's not true. So, to the extent of our knowledge, anyway.
I want Marcia to write a book about this as well. So I think there's many books in this particular bundle of research.
Other questions or thoughts, comments? Okay. Thank you very much. There are books available, by the way.
We can sort of, if people want to come forward, we can just talk.
When I wrote a monograph about Edward A. Pollard, and this was about his ideas, I did go visit the plantation in Nelson County, Virginia, where it was in his family that he got his romanticized ideas from growing up. And they were waiting for an heir to come of age. So the caretaker, really terrific redneck type, was showing me around, and there they knew about Miss Peggy Reeves as if she were walking through, the place then, and they had never heard of the Pollards as relatives there. But the caretaker had been the son of the former caretaker, and he talked about when he was helping his daddy clear out the cemetery one time when it was overgrown, as it had again become. He asked him, "Daddy, what are all these Pollards doing in the Reeves graveyard?" And his daddy's answer to everything was, "They was all kin."
Yeah.
And that's the answer to a lot of things.
Yeah, it is, yeah. And it turns out, from looking at
that
the,
phrase has kept coming up through my life ever since, over and over again.
initially, of course, when Carl contacted me, I thought perhaps someone in my family was the father of the Ellises, which it turns out apparently not, because of Hezekiah Ellis's importance in the naming of the family. But when I've gone in to do the family trees of both the Ellises and the Whizzigers, I found that there may be someone in the Ellis family tree who was fathered by someone in my family. So I'm wanting to find out about all those connections as well. Anyway, there are books available of Carl's wonderful book. I know I'm going to be buying one for my sister for Christmas, and also refreshments, so please help yourself. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.